November 27th, 1950. 0340 hours. Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. Private First Class Robert Chen, of the U.S. 1st Marine Division, couldn't feel his legs anymore. The Korean winter had stripped away sensation from everything below his waist. He lay in the snow where he'd fallen 12 hours earlier, abandoned during the chaotic retreat from Chinese forces that had surrounded his battalion. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. His uniform was soaked through from crawling through ice. His rifle lay 3 feet away, frozen to the ground where it had fallen when his strength had finally given out. He was 20 years old, born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents who'd fled communist revolution, enlisted in the Marines at 18, partially to prove his American loyalty to neighbors who'd questioned it, partially because military service offered steady pay and clear purpose. Trained at Camp Pendleton, deployed to Korea in September. 3 months ago he'd been practicing amphibious assaults in California sunshine. Now he was freezing to death in a country he'd never heard of until this war started. The irony wasn't lost on him, even through the hypothermic fog clouding his thoughts. Robert Chen, American Marine of Chinese descent, dying in Korea while fighting against Chinese communist forces. His parents had fled the communists. Now their son was being killed by them. The circular absurdity would have been funny if he hadn't been so cold. He'd stopped shivering an hour ago. That was bad. He knew enough about hypothermia to recognize that when you stopped shivering, you were entering the final stages. Your body had given up trying to warm itself. Death would come as sleep, they said. Peaceful. Just close your eyes and drift away. Robert tried to stay awake, tried to remember warmth, his mother's kitchen in San Francisco, steam rising from rice cooker, the smell of ginger and soy sauce, summer days at Ocean Beach, the impossible California heat that he'd complained about and would give anything to feel again. Then he heard footsteps crunching through snow. Chinese voices. Close. Getting closer. Robert's training kicked in through the hypothermia. Enemy soldiers. He should reach for his rifle, should fight, should resist. But his arms wouldn't move. His body had shut down everything except the absolute minimum functions needed to keep him breathing a few minutes longer. The footsteps stopped beside him. Robert opened his eyes. The lids felt frozen, each blink requiring conscious effort. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he saw a figure standing over him. Chinese People's Volunteer Army uniform, quilted winter jacket, fur-lined cap, young face, maybe even younger than Robert. The Chinese soldier was holding a rifle, aimed down at Robert's chest. This was it. Wounded enemy soldier. Helpless in the snow. The Chinese soldier would either shoot him or leave him to freeze. Either way, Robert Chen would die in this frozen Korean valley, another casualty in a war that most Americans couldn't even locate on a map. But the Chinese soldier didn't shoot. He stood there, rifle pointed at Robert's chest, staring down with an expression Robert couldn't read. Surprise? Confusion? Recognition? Then the Chinese soldier did something that Robert's training, his propaganda briefings, his entire understanding of communist enemy soldiers had never prepared him for. He lowered his rifle, unslung the thick quilted blanket he'd been carrying on his pack, and carefully, almost gently, draped it over Robert's frozen body. Robert stared up at the Chinese soldier, unable to process what was happening. The enemy was covering him with a blanket, providing warmth, potentially saving his life. The Chinese soldier said something in Mandarin that Robert's San Francisco Cantonese couldn't understand, but the tone was clear, not hostile, not mocking. Almost apologetic, sad. Then the soldier turned and walked away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving his blanket with an enemy who'd been sent to kill him. Robert lay there, the blanket's warmth slowly penetrating his frozen uniform, and tried to understand what had just happened. A communist Chinese soldier had just saved the life of an American Marine. The propaganda had said the Chinese were inhuman monsters, fanatical communists who valued ideology over life. But a Chinese soldier had just given away his own blanket in minus 30-degree weather to save an enemy who would have killed him if their positions had been reversed. For the first time since landing in Korea, Robert Chen questioned whether everything he'd been told about this war was true. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir, November-December 1950, would become one of the Korean War's defining engagements and one of the most brutal battles in U.S. Marine Corps history. What made Chosin extraordinary wasn't just the combat intensity, but the environmental conditions that made simple survival a greater challenge than enemy action. The numbers documented the horror: temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, winds reaching 40 miles per hour, creating wind chills of -70, frostbite casualties exceeding combat casualties in many units, weapons freezing solid and becoming useless, morphine syrettes freezing and shattering, blood plasma freezing before it could be administered, rations frozen so hard they required axes to break apart. The 1st Marine Division, approximately 15,000 men, had advanced to the Chosin Reservoir in late November 1950 as part of General MacArthur's push toward the Chinese border. The plan was to end the war by Christmas, to reunify Korea under South Korean government, to demonstrate American military supremacy in the Cold War's first hot conflict. Then, China intervened. On November 27, approximately 120,000 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers attacked, surrounding the Marine Division and cutting off their supply lines. What followed was a 17-day fighting retreat through 78 miles of mountain roads, constant combat against numerically superior forces, and weather conditions that killed as efficiently as enemy bullets. The Marines called it the Frozen Chosin. The official term was breakout from encirclement. The reality was a desperate struggle for survival where cold was as deadly as combat. American casualties: 1,029 killed in action, 4,894 wounded, 4,582 non-battle casualties, primarily frostbite, 192 missing. Chinese casualties: estimated 19,000 killed, 29,000 wounded, but also catastrophic frostbite casualties because Chinese forces lacked winter equipment adequate for the extreme conditions. Both sides suffered equally from the cold. The environment didn't care about ideology, national allegiance, or political systems. It killed Americans and Chinese with equal efficiency, creating circumstances where survival required cooperation more than conflict. The soldier who gave Robert Chen his blanket was named Liu Wei, 21 years old, former farmer from Shandong Province, conscripted into the People's Liberation Army in 1949, volunteered for Korean service in October 1950. He'd been told he was fighting American imperialism, defending Chinese borders against Western aggression, supporting Korean socialist brothers against capitalist invasion. Liu Wei's journey to that frozen Korean valley had begun with Chinese Civil War. He'd fought for the communists against the nationalists, believing Mao's promises about land reform and peasant liberation. When the Civil War ended in communist victory, Liu expected to return to farming. Instead, he received orders: volunteer for Korean service or face political suspicion about your revolutionary commitment. The volunteering was mandatory. Refusing meant being labeled counter-revolutionary, possibly being sent to re-education camps, definitely losing any chance of advancement, or even basic survival in New China. Liu Wei, like hundreds of thousands of other Chinese soldiers, volunteered. The training had been minimal: political indoctrination about American imperialism and the necessity of defending socialism, basic military drill, weapons familiarization with rifles that dated from World War II or earlier, then deployment to Korea in October 1950, crossing the Yalu River under cover of darkness, moving south to positions around the Chosin Reservoir. The conditions were catastrophic from the start. Chinese forces lacked adequate winter equipment, no proper winter boots, no insulated sleeping bags, inadequate winter uniforms. Supply lines were minimal. Food consisted of rice balls that froze solid within hours of being cooked. Many soldiers had only summer uniforms with thin quilted jackets, providing minimal insulation against temperatures that dropped to -40. Liu Wei's unit had attacked the American Marines on November 27 as ordered. They'd advanced through snow and darkness, engaging in close combat with American forces that had superior firepower but were equally vulnerable to cold. Liu had seen his comrades freeze to death in firing positions, had watched men with frostbitten feet continue fighting because retreating meant being labeled coward, had experienced hunger and cold that made combat almost a relief, because at least moving and fighting generated body heat. By November 27th, Liu Wei's unit had been in combat and extreme cold for 3 days. They'd achieved tactical objectives, surrounding American forces, cutting supply lines, but at devastating cost. Of his original platoon of 45 men, 18 had been killed in combat. Another 12 had severe frostbite. 3 had simply frozen to death in their positions. The survivors were exhausted, hungry, and questioning whether any ideological objective was worth this suffering. When Liu Wei found Robert Chen in the snow, he'd been separated from his unit during a confused night engagement. He was trying to find his way back to Chinese lines, moving through terrain where Americans and Chinese positions intermingled in the darkness and snow. Finding an enemy soldier, wounded, helpless, clearly dying from cold, should have been straightforward. Leave him to freeze, or shoot him to ensure he didn't recover and return to combat. Those were the logical military options. But Liu Wei looked down at the American Marine and saw something that disrupted every propaganda message he'd absorbed. Another young man, same age as Liu, dying from the same cold that was killing Liu's comrades, wearing a different uniform but experiencing identical suffering. The American was Chinese. Liu could see that clearly. The facial features, the bone structure, a Chinese man fighting for America against Chinese forces. The complexity of that recognition cut through political ideology. This wasn't abstract American imperialism. This was a young man of Chinese descent, probably with family history, similar to Liu's own, dying in Korean snow because of decisions made by distant leaders. Liu Wei looked at his own blanket, one of his most valuable possessions, essential for survival in these conditions. Giving it away meant increasing his own risk of freezing to death. Keeping it meant watching another human being die from cold that Liu himself was experiencing. He made his decision in seconds. Unslung the blanket, covered the American soldier, spoke words that probably weren't understood, but conveyed his meaning. I can't save you completely, but I won't let you freeze without trying to help. Then Liu walked away knowing he'd just violated military orders, compromised his ideological purity, and possibly condemned himself to freezing death by giving away essential survival equipment. But he'd also recognized shared humanity in circumstances designed to deny it, and that recognition, in that moment, mattered more than any political directive. Robert Chen survived the night. The Chinese blanket retained enough body heat to prevent the final stages of hypothermia. When dawn came and American Marines secured the area during their retreat, they found Robert still alive, wrapped in an enemy blanket that had saved his life. The Marine corpsmen who evacuated him were confused by the Chinese blanket. Had Robert captured it, taken it from a dead Chinese soldier? Robert, too weak to speak clearly, couldn't explain that an enemy had given it to him voluntarily. He was evacuated to the battalion aid station, then to the division hospital, then to a hospital ship offshore, and finally to a military hospital in Japan. Severe frostbite required amputation of 3 toes and 2 fingers, but he survived, and he kept the Chinese blanket through the entire evacuation, refusing to let medical personnel discard it. When he could finally speak clearly, Robert tried to explain what had happened. A Chinese soldier had found him dying, had covered him with a blanket, had saved his life. The intelligence officers who debriefed him were skeptical. Chinese soldiers didn't save American Marines. The story contradicted everything known about communist fanaticism and ideological commitment. But Robert insisted, and he had the blanket as evidence. Standard Chinese People's Volunteer Army issue, quilted cotton with distinctive pattern, definitely not American equipment. The incident was noted in Robert's medical records, but classified as unexplained circumstances. The military preferred clear narratives about heroic Marines and fanatical communists. Stories about enemy soldiers saving American lives complicated the propaganda messaging necessary for maintaining public support for the war. Robert recovered from his physical injuries over several months, but the psychological impact lasted longer. He'd been saved by the enemy, a communist Chinese soldier. Everything Robert had been taught to hate had chosen mercy over orders, humanity over ideology. It changed how Robert understood the war. The Chinese weren't inhuman monsters. They were soldiers like him, young men conscripted into a conflict they didn't choose, suffering from cold and hunger and fear, capable of compassion even toward enemies. Liu Wei survived the Chosin campaign, though he lost 4 toes to frostbite and nearly starved during the Chinese withdrawal from contact with American forces. His unit suffered approximately 70% casualties, killed, wounded, or incapacitated by cold. He never told his commanders about giving his blanket to an American soldier. Such an act would have been labeled counter-revolutionary sympathy for imperialism, possibly resulting in political re-education or worse. Instead, Liu claimed he'd lost the blanket during combat, accepting punishment for equipment loss as preferable to admission of mercy toward the enemy. But Liu couldn't forget the American Marine's face, young, Chinese in appearance, dying from cold, that transcended political ideology. The encounter haunted him through the remainder of the Korean War, through his return to China in 1953, through decades of Mao's political campaigns, where any sympathy for Americans could be fatal. During the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, Liu Wei's Korean War service came under scrutiny. Red Guards questioned his revolutionary commitment, searched for evidence of ideological impurity. Liu Wei never mentioned the blanket incident. It remained his private secret, a moment of humanity in a life increasingly dominated by political fanaticism. Only after Mao's death and China's gradual opening in the late 1970s did Liu feel safe enough to tell his family about what he'd done in Korea. His children's reactions surprised him. His daughter asked, "Did you ever wonder if that American soldier survived?" His son said, "You saved someone's life. That matters more than politics." Liu Wei began wondering if the American Marine had survived, if he'd ever returned home, if the blanket had made any difference beyond that single night. In 1988, nearly 40 years after the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, Robert Chen attended a Korean War veterans reunion in San Francisco. He was 60 years old, retired from a career as a teacher, married with 3 children. The war was distant history to most Americans. But Robert still kept the Chinese blanket, now faded and worn, in a cedar chest in his home. At the reunion, Robert met a journalist researching personal stories from the Chosin campaign. When Robert mentioned the Chinese soldier who'd saved his life, the journalist recognized the story's power. "Have you ever tried to find him?" the journalist asked. Robert admitted he hadn't. How would he even begin? He didn't know the soldier's name, didn't speak Mandarin, had no way to search among millions of Chinese veterans, even if China's government permitted such contact, which it didn't during the Cold War. But 1988 was different. China had begun opening to the West. Academic exchanges were occurring. Some limited communication between American and Chinese veterans was becoming possible. The journalist proposed writing an article about Robert's story and trying to distribute it in China through emerging academic networks. It was a long shot. Even if the article reached China, finding one specific soldier among hundreds of thousands who'd served at Chosin seemed impossible. Robert agreed to try. The journalist wrote the article for the San Francisco Chronicle, detailing Robert's experience and describing the soldier who'd saved him. Young, probably early 20s in 1950, separated from his unit, gave away his blanket to an enemy Marine. The article ran in December 1988. Through academic contacts, a Chinese-language version was circulated in Beijing and Shanghai. The chances of Liu Wei seeing it seemed infinitesimally small. But sometimes, impossible things happen. In March 1989, Robert Chen received a letter forwarded through the journalist's contacts. It was written in Mandarin, translated by the academic network. "To the American Marine I covered with my blanket. I do not know if you are the correct person. Perhaps many soldiers were saved by blankets during that terrible winter. But I read the article describing November 27, 1950, near Chosin Reservoir, and the details match my memory. I am Liu Wei, former soldier in Chinese People's Volunteer Army. I was 21 years old during Chosin campaign. I became separated from my unit during night of November 27th. I was trying to find my way back to Chinese positions when I found you in the snow. You were dying from cold. I could see this clearly. I knew I should leave you, or perhaps shoot you, as my training required. But when I looked at your face, I saw that you were Chinese, like me. I thought about my own brother, also young, also far from home. I could not leave you to freeze. I gave you my blanket. I do not know why I did this. It violated my orders. It could have resulted in punishment if discovered. But in that moment, seeing another human being dying from same cold that was killing my comrades, I could not walk away without trying to help. I have wondered for nearly 40 years whether you survived, whether my blanket made any difference, whether you ever knew that the Chinese soldier who helped you was also suffering, also afraid, also questioning why we were fighting each other in frozen Korean mountains. I am glad you survived.
I am glad my small action mattered. I want you to know that not all Chinese soldiers hated Americans. We were told to hate you, but hatred is difficult to maintain when you see enemy soldiers suffering exactly as you suffer.
The war ended long ago. China has changed. I have changed. But I have never forgotten you, and I hope this letter reaches you, so you know that the blanket was given with genuine hope for your survival. With respect, Liu Wei. Robert read the letter 3 times, each time with increasing emotion. The soldier who'd saved his life was real, was alive, had thought about Robert for 4 decades, just as Robert had thought about him. Robert wrote back immediately. Dear Liu Wei, your letter reached me, and I cannot adequately express my gratitude, not just for the blanket you gave me in 1950, but for this letter proving that you survived and remembered. I kept your blanket. It is still in my home, folded carefully in a chest where I keep important things. For nearly 40 years, it has reminded me that enemies can choose humanity over hatred, that individual soldiers are not the same as the governments that send them to war. You saved my life. Without your blanket, I would have frozen to death in that valley. I returned home, married, raised 3 children, became a teacher. All of this, my entire life, after November 27, 1950, exists because you chose mercy. I want you to know that I understood, even then, what you'd risked. I was too weak to speak, but I saw your face, saw your hesitation, saw your decision to help, despite everything your training must have told you. That image has stayed with me forever. You wrote that hatred is difficult to maintain when you see enemy soldiers suffering. I learned the same lesson. After you saved me, I could never again think of Chinese soldiers as inhuman enemies. You proved that we were all young men caught in decisions made by distant leaders, suffering equally from cold and fear. I wish I could thank you in person. Perhaps someday, if our governments permit it, we could meet. Until then, please know that your kindness 40 years ago changed how I understood the world. You taught me that humanity transcends politics, that individual choices matter even in the midst of war's chaos. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for proving that mercy is possible, even in the worst circumstances. With profound gratitude and respect, Robert Chen. The letters continued sporadically through the late 1980s and early 1990s, limited by China's political restrictions and the complexity of international correspondence. But Robert and Liu Wei maintained contact, 2 former enemies who'd become connected through a single act of mercy on a frozen Korean battlefield. In 1995, 45 years after the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, China and the United States permitted a limited Korean War veterans exchange program. Robert Chen and Liu Wei were both selected to participate, traveling to Seoul for a joint memorial service honoring all soldiers who'd fought in the war. They met in a hotel lobby in Seoul. 2 old men, both in their 60s, both carrying the physical scars of frostbite and old wounds. They recognized each other despite 4 decades. Robert from Liu's photograph sent with his letters, Liu from the Chinese facial features that had made him save an American Marine in 1950. They shook hands. No translator was necessary for that gesture. Then they sat together while interpreters helped them speak. I brought your blanket, Robert said, pulling the faded quilted cotton from his bag. I have kept it all these years. Liu Wei took the blanket, his hands trembling slightly, as he held the object he'd given away in a moment of compassion that had haunted and defined him for 45 years. "It still has my platoon's marking," Liu said quietly, pointing to faded characters stitched in one corner. I had forgotten that detail. They talked for hours, comparing their experiences at Chosin, their lives after the war, the ways that single frozen night had shaped their understanding of humanity and conflict. "I have thought often about why I gave you the blanket," Liu Wei said through the interpreter. "I have concluded that I simply recognized you as a human being in that moment, not as American enemy, not as ideological threat, but as another young man dying from cold. That recognition was stronger than my training." "Your recognition saved my life," Robert replied, "but it also changed how I understood the world. After the war, I became a teacher. I taught my students that enemies are usually just people on the other side of decisions they didn't make. You proved that to me." The meeting lasted 3 days. Robert and Liu Wei attended memorial services together, met other veterans from both sides, participated in ceremonies honoring the dead. When they parted, Robert returned the blanket to Liu Wei. "This should be yours," Robert said. "It represents your choice to show mercy when cruelty would have been easier." Liu Wei refused. "It is yours. It represents the life that continued because of that choice. Keep it. Remember that humanity is always possible, even in the worst circumstances." Robert kept the blanket. Liu Wei returned to China. They maintained correspondence until Liu Wei's death in 2007 at age 78. Robert Chen died in 2018 at age 88. In his will, he donated the Chinese blanket to the National Museum of the Marine Corps with a letter explaining its significance. "This blanket was given to me by a Chinese soldier who chose mercy over orders, humanity over ideology. It saved my life on November 27, 1950, during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. I kept this blanket for 68 years as a reminder that enemies are not inherently evil. They are human beings who've been placed in conflict by circumstances beyond their control. Individual soldiers can choose compassion even when governments demand hatred. I want future Marines to see this blanket and understand that showing mercy to enemies does not make you weak. It makes you human." Liu Wei's decision to save me proved that humanity transcends politics, that individual kindness matters even in war's midst. This blanket represents the best of what soldiers can be, not killing machines, but human beings who remember compassion even in the worst circumstances. The blanket is now displayed at the museum with a plaque explaining its history. Visitors can see the faded quilted cotton, the Chinese characters marking Liu Wei's unit, the fabric that retained just enough warmth to save Robert Chen's life. The display includes photographs of both men, young Marines and young Chinese soldier in 1950, old men shaking hands in Seoul in 1995. It includes excerpts from their letters. It tells the story of how one act of mercy created a connection that lasted 45 years and continues to teach lessons about humanity and conflict. The story of Liu Wei's blanket resonates because it reveals a fundamental truth about war and humanity. Individual soldiers, even in the midst of conflict driven by ideology and national interest, retain the capacity to recognize enemies as human beings and choose mercy over cruelty. Liu Wei didn't save Robert Chen because of political calculation or strategic advantage. He saved him because, in that moment, he saw another human being dying from cold and couldn't walk away without helping. The decision violated his orders, risked his own survival, and contradicted his training, but it affirmed his humanity in circumstances designed to deny it. Robert Chen's survival and his lifelong gratitude demonstrate the lasting impact of individual compassion. One act of mercy, taking 30 seconds and costing one blanket, created effects that rippled through decades. Robert lived a full life, raised children, taught students, and spent 68 years remembering and honoring the enemy soldier who'd chosen kindness. The broader lesson extends beyond individual stories. The Korean War, like most wars, was portrayed in stark terms: freedom versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism, good versus evil. But the reality experienced by soldiers like Liu Wei and Robert Chen was more complex. Young men on both sides suffered equally from cold, fear, and hunger. The ideological differences that justified the war mattered less than the universal human experiences of pain and survival. Liu Wei's decision to give his blanket to Robert Chen didn't end the Korean War. It didn't resolve the political differences between China and America. It didn't prevent the continued suffering and death that characterized the conflict. But it proved that even in war's midst, individual human connections remain possible, and those connections can transcend the hatreds that governments promote. For modern observers, the story offers guidance about seeing beyond propaganda and recognizing shared humanity even in enemies. Every conflict features narratives about why they are different, dangerous, deserving of hatred. Liu Wei and Robert Chen's story reminds us that they are usually young people following orders, experiencing fear and suffering, capable of compassion, if given the chance to see enemies as human beings. The blanket that saved Robert Chen's life remains in a museum, not as a trophy of victory or symbol of defeat, but as evidence that mercy is always possible, that individual choices matter even in systemic conflicts, and that humanity persists even when everything, training, ideology, circumstance, encourages us to forget it. Liu Wei gave away his blanket in a frozen Korean valley and walked away expecting to freeze himself. He survived. So did Robert Chen. And their story survives as testament to the possibility of choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier, humanity when ideology demands hatred, and connection when conflict encourages separation. That remains the enduring lesson. In every war, every conflict, every situation where we're told to hate enemies, individual soldiers retain the power to recognize shared humanity and choose mercy. Liu Wei's blanket proves it's possible. Robert Chen's survival proves it matters, and the story's continuation across 45 years proves that such moments of humanity outlast the conflicts that try to suppress them.